Alright, this presentation covers Chapter 23, Section 1, pages 542 to 546. As you can see from the title, the causes of World War I, we're actually going to look at a couple different areas, all related, however, to the World War that is going to start. We saw previously about the United States and their imperialistic behavior, how they were gaining territories throughout the Pacific. They had annexed Hawaii, the Philippines, taken over Guam, Cuba. So they were primarily involved in imperialistic moves over in the Pacific. Meanwhile, at the same time, over in Europe, there was a lot of that same kind of behavior going on. The major European powers were trying to expand their empires into Asia and to Africa primarily, and this is going to cause several problems that are going to lead up to the beginning of World War I. And also, by the way, when this war was being fought, they didn't call it World War I because they never assumed there would be a second one, and they'd have to number these things. So at the time, this was called the Great War. So you'll see in videos and some other things, people are talking about the Great War. That's what we call today World War I. Alright, the main causes of World War I, and if you notice, main is in quotations because the MAIN all stand for the various causes of the war. The M for militarism, A for alliances, I for imperialism, and N for nationalism. So it's an easy way to remember what the causes are, because you're going to need to know all these very definitely on your test, and your essay question, especially on your test, is going to cover this. So again, stop when you need to, take notes, fill out your worksheets, that kind of thing as we go along. So we're going to look at each of these main causes individually. The glossary, they're not defining militarism simply because it's kind of self-explanatory. It's talking about the military, and we assume that you know that that means armies and so on. But alliances, if you're not familiar with the word, it's an agreement made between two or more countries to give each other help if it is needed. Imperialism, as we've already been seeing, is when a country takes over other countries and makes them subject to their rule. And lastly, nationalism means being a strong supporter of the rights and interests of one's country. You really kind of see this in play like the Olympics, when everybody's, cheering for their particular country. My country's the best country, that kind of thing. That's a nationalistic kind of attitude, and you're going to see that throughout Europe at the time. So first we're looking at militarism. Europe enters the 20th century in an arms race. All the great European nations are trying to build up their military. Germany in particular wanted to have the biggest army that there was. Britain always had the strongest navy, and they continued to try to increase the size and strength of their navy. Russia and France also didn't want to, fall behind here. So all these European countries are building up their military and the products of war. You can see Germany was battling with the UK as the United Kingdom. That's Britain. As I said, they had the strongest navy in the world at that time, and Germany was trying to equal that. Britain was fearful that Germany would eventually attack them. You can see the numbers there. Within about 35 years, you can see the army sizes have doubled and tripled. So again, each of these countries building up their military. And again, especially in the area of the Navy, it was Britain and Germany kind of battling it out for who would have the biggest and the baddest Navy going on. And the new ships that were built at the time were called dreadnoughts, and there's a picture there of one. Next, A, we have the alliances. By 1914, all the major powers were linked in a system of alliances. So if one country were attacked, another country would come in. They were bound to defend them because of this alliance, basically saying, if something happens to you, I've got your back. I'm going to come in and help you and defend you. So there was a system of alliances throughout Europe. Prior to the war, you had what was called the Triple Alliance, and you can see there the three countries, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. They had signed agreements basically that, again, they promised to defend one another if any of them were attacked. Then you had the Triple Entente, and you can see that's Russia, France, and Britain, kind of the countries surrounding um, the Triple Alliance. Their agreement wasn't as strict. It wasn't like if, somebody attacks you, we're going to come to your aid. It wasn't as strict an alliance, but basically just the idea that, we're going to be supportive of one another. You also had Russia had an alliance with Serbia and with the Slavic people that lived in that area known as the Balkans at the time. There were people of different nationalities that were being forced to live in the Austria-Hungary Empire, and they weren't happy about that, but Russia had alliances with them as well. Next we have our I, imperialism, and it's again a word you should be familiar with. We've been looking at it for a few chapters now. So in the years before World War I, all of the major all of the major countries were in competition to make colonies, and that was especially true in Africa and Asia. They were all kind of dividing up those continents among themselves. Britain and France and Germany in particular had a lot of colonies had developed in Africa and Asia. So all of this behavior is creating a lot of rivalries in Europe at the time. They're fighting over land, as you can see. They're fighting over military strength. Who's going to have the biggest and the best navies and armies. They're fighting over who's going to be the most powerful, the most influential. So all of this competition is eventually going to lead to problems. And then you have nationalism. They said this is an age when all the nations wanted to assert their power and independence. Again, it's the idea of my country's better than your country, my country's stronger, it's faster, it's more important, it's more influential. So you had, again, these rivalries developing among all these great nations in Europe, just as, who was the biggest and the best. That shows you a map there of all the different nationalities. As I said, these are all different peoples: Czechs, Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks, all these different kind of nationalities that are being forced to live under the rule of Austria-Hungary, and they weren't happy about that. They each wanted to become their own little country, and they didn't think it was fair that they were being forced into others, and Serbia is one of those as well, and that's going to be where kind of the problem starts. So at the time, Europe was called a powder keg, and a powder keg is like a big barrel of dynamite, basically, just waiting for a match to set it off and to explode. So the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was considered the spark that blew up Europe, basically, and began World War I. What happened was Archduke Franz Ferdinand is from the Austria-Hungary Empire. He's visiting Bosnia, which is in the Serbia, the Balkans area. And you had a group at that time called the Black Hands, and they were a group of Serbian nationalists who wanted their independence from Austria-Hungary, and they felt that if they assassinated somebody as important as an archduke, then that might get them their freedom and be able to break away from Austrian rule. So you had this kind of handful of guys who had made plans. For their first plan was to blow up his car. He and his wife were riding around the town in their car. Well, that plan didn't work. It backfired. He went on kind of about his business, and then just kind of incidentally, Gavrilo Princip, who's one of these conspirators here, he just kind of accidentally on the street runs into the Archduke who's in his car, and he's got his gun on him, so he fires and he shoots the Archduke and his wife. And there's a famous artist drawing of the time. You can see Gavrilo Princip on your left holding the gun, shooting. He shoots both the Archduke and his wife right there in their car, and they're killed. And that is basically, as I said, the spark that's going to start World War I, or the Great War. So again, this alliance system, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia because it was a Serbian guy who shot the Archduke. Serbia had this alliance with Russia, so Russia gets pulled in. Germany has an alliance with Austria-Hungary, so they get pulled in. So all these different countries all get dragged into the war, and World War I starts. So now the war begins. The names of the groups are changed now. The Triple Entente is now known as the Allied Powers, and again it's France, Great Britain, Russia. Italy actually switches sides and they join the Allies, and eventually the United States is going to come in towards the end of the war and fight with the Allies. The Central Powers are Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. And you can see in the map of Europe here, the Central Powers are kind of centrally located in Europe, so that's kind of why they got that name. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. The Allied powers are surrounding them. So World War I was kind of a multi-front war, and a front means the areas where the battle's happening. And you can see Germany had to deal with the Eastern Front and fighting Russia, and then on the Western Front having to fight France and Great Britain. So they had a more difficult time because they had to divide their armies to be able to fight on basically both fronts. The Germans, though, had come up with a plan called the Schlieffen Plan, and it was basically they felt that it would take Russia a while to mobilize its army and get into place, so they didn't feel the need to kind of rush over to the Eastern Front and defend over there. So they concentrated first on the Western Front, and they sent their troops through Belgium. Belgium was a neutral nation. It was supposed to be left alone, but Germany ignored that. And they marched through Belgium into France, and the war started primarily in France. Schlieffen is the German general who came up with this idea, this plan. However, it didn't work because the French army was there and ready for them. You'll read a lot and you'll see the videos about trench warfare. Both sides basically dug in. Along the German side, they had their trenches. The French and the British had their trenches. It's basically living in a hole in the ground. Just a horrible way to have to live. If it rained, then you're just living in a big mud pit. But not a lot happened. The no man's land was the area in between both sides. One side would come over the top and they would try to advance on the enemy, but then they're pushed back, and then the other side would do the same thing and then they were pushed back. This went on for about 3 years where nothing was gained. Thousands of men are killed, but neither side makes any kind of significant advances. It's just like a stalemate. Nobody's moving anywhere and everybody's just miserable living in these mud pits in the ground. So a terrible way to have to live. Here's another picture. They see a picture of the trench there. They're not very big. That's the no man's land, kind of the barren area where if any fighting happened, it happened right there, but then both sides would always be pushed back into their trenches. Now also we're looking at new technologies that are developed in World War I, and really World War I is often called the first modern war because of this, because of the new technologies that are developed. You have flamethrowers, which do literally what it says. It throws flame and fire upon your enemy. Grenade launchers were first used in World War I. Poison gas, first time used in World War I, and that led to the use of gas masks. You can see in the lower picture there, men wearing the gas masks. But the problem with poison gas is if the wind shifts, then if you attack your enemy with the poison gas and the direction of the wind changes, it can blow back on you. So it was always very kind of a dangerous thing to use the poison gas, but it was really effective. You'd be blinded. You'd get these terrible blisters all over you. You'd suffocate and die if you breathed in too much of it. It was just a horrific weapon used at the time. And basically, after World War I was over, the nations of the world pretty much came to an agreement among themselves that they wouldn't use poison gas anymore. So you don't hear a whole lot about it in any of the other wars that happened after World War I, simply because of the problems in using it. Like I said, if the wind changes direction, it's blowing back on you, and obviously can cause a lot of trouble. The machine guns also first being used, and nothing like you see today where you can just, hold it in your hand. These were much larger, much heavier. They had to be placed down into the ground. They weren't very mobile. Um, they oftentimes would not work effectively. So the early versions of the machine gun were not always that effective. The tanks are also first used, and there's a French version of the tank from the Renault car making company. You can see very small in size, only a couple men fit inside. The use of the tank, though, really kind of put an end to the trench warfare, because the tanks could go through no man's land and attack your enemy. So the development of the tank had a very important effect on kind of changing the way that the war was being fought. The British had their version of a tank as well. As you can see, it can be very effective, but the problem is, or it was in the early versions of the tanks, they didn't do well in the mud and the rain. They would get stuck, as you can see in that particular picture. So the early versions of the tank, nothing like you're kind of used to seeing in movies today, but they were a game changer as far as the way the war was being fought. Another important development was the U-boat. And the U stands for the German word Unterseeboot, which in German just means under the sea. This was a submarine, what we would call a submarine today. Very effective. They didn't have radar then. You wouldn't see it coming. They're under the ocean, so they're invisible to the ships up on top, and destroyed many, many, many ships. And basically, the use of U-boats is one of the reasons that the United States got pulled into the war. When the German U-boat blew up the passenger ship, the Lusitania, 1,200 people killed, 100 and something of them Americans. America was outraged. President Wilson basically warned Germany, if you don't stop firing on passenger ships, then basically, you're going to pull us into the war. And Germany wasn't ready for that yet. They kind of figured the U.S. would come into this eventually, but they wanted to delay that as long as possible. So initially, the Germans agreed that they would stop firing on passenger ships, but that agreement didn't last long, and eventually they started just firing on any ship that didn't belong to them. And eventually that's going to pull the United States into the war. And lastly, the airplane, another game changer, first used in World War I. They were first used just for reconnaissance, and they would fly over and look at battlefield positions, and they could report back, this is where the enemy is, we saw them, hiding over here, we saw them over there. So first they were used just as that. Then initially pilots just used their own personal guns and they would shoot at each other, until eventually somebody figured out, why don't we take a machine gun and mount it onto the plane, and then they started shooting at each other with machine guns. So the plane developed into a very important part of the war.